The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable as a well-dressed woman with perfectly manicured nails and designer accessories loudly berated the flight attendant. "I specifically requested not to be seated next to anyone recognizable," she hissed, making no attempt to lower her voice. Her cold gaze shifted deliberately toward Sandra Bullock, who had just settled into her window seat, trying to remain inconspicuous behind dark sunglasses and a simple baseball cap. The acclaimed actress visibly stiffened but maintained her composure, pretending to be absorbed in a book. "Do you know who I am?" the woman continued, her voice rising further. "I'm Eileen Winters. My husband owns half the real estate in downtown Manhattan." She adjusted her diamond-encrusted watch with a flourish. "I cannot be expected to endure a 5-hour flight next to someone who will attract attention and disturb my peace." The flight attendant, a veteran of many years in the air, struggled to maintain her professional demeanor. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Winters, but the flight is completely full. I'm afraid there are no other first-class seats available." By now, every passenger in the exclusive cabin was watching the scene unfold. Sandra Bullock kept her head down, clearly uncomfortable with the unwanted attention, but Eileen wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and began taking photos of Sandra without permission. "At least I'll get something out of this inconvenience. My friends won't believe I'm stuck sitting next to someone who hasn't had a decent film in years." Her laugh was sharp and cutting. "Maybe you should stick to those disaster movies, they mirror your career trajectory perfectly." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Even in the privileged bubble of first class, such blatant disrespect crossed a line. Sandra finally looked up, hurt flashing briefly across her face before she composed herself. The flight attendant moved to intervene again, but before she could speak, a deep, calm voice came from across the aisle. "Excuse me." Heads turned toward the source of the voice. There, in the dim cabin lighting, sat Keanu Reeves, his presence previously unnoticed by most of the passengers. His expression was unreadable as he unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly stood up. The atmosphere shifted instantly. No one, not even Eileen Winters, could predict what would happen next. 6 hours earlier, Sandra Bullock had been reluctant to even board this flight. After wrapping up 3 intensive months of filming a new drama in Vancouver, all she wanted was to return home quietly to her children in Los Angeles. The studio had arranged the first-class ticket as a thank you for completing the project ahead of schedule, despite several production challenges. "It's just one flight," her assistant Denise had assured her that morning while helping her pack. 5 hours, and you'll be home with the kids. You deserve a comfortable trip after all that work." Sandra had nodded, though she typically preferred keeping a lower profile when traveling. Unlike some celebrities who embraced the spotlight at every opportunity, she had always valued her privacy, especially in recent years as she focused more on her family and selective projects that spoke to her personally. At the airport, she'd arrived early, wearing minimal makeup and casual clothes, jeans, a simple black sweater, and her favorite worn baseball cap, hoping to blend in with the morning crowd. The VIP check-in had gone smoothly, and she'd been grateful when the staff discreetly escorted her through security to avoid any commotion. The quiet moments in the first-class lounge had been pleasant. Sandra had spent the time reviewing a script her agent had sent over, occasionally glancing up to people watch, a habit that had informed many of her most authentic performances over the years. She hadn't noticed Keanu Reeves in the lounge, though he must have been there. Their paths had crossed professionally several times over the decades, but they weren't close friends who kept up with each other's schedules. When boarding began, Sandra had been among the first to walk onto the plane, settling into her window seat with relief. She'd exchanged warm smiles with the flight attendants who recognized her but appreciatively maintained their professionalism. For a brief moment, it had seemed the journey would be uneventful. Then Eileen Winters had arrived, immediately creating a bubble of tension around her. From the moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, the woman had found fault with everything: the temperature, the selection of pre-flight beverages, the placement of her carry-on in the overhead compartment. "Is this how you treat your premium customers?" she had demanded of the increasingly flustered flight attendant. Sandra had observed discreetly over the top of her book as the flight crew worked to appease the difficult passenger. It wasn't uncommon to encounter entitled behavior in first class, and Sandra had learned long ago that staying out of such situations was the wisest course of action. Other passengers had begun boarding by then. A retired couple took their seats near the front, their movements suggesting they were well accustomed to premium travel, but without Eileen's need to announce their status. A young tech entrepreneur, barely in his 30s but clearly successful, settled in with his noise-canceling headphones and laptop. And then, without fanfare, Keanu Reeves had boarded. Unlike Sandra's attempt at anonymity, he made no particular effort to disguise himself, yet carried himself with such humble normalcy that he attracted little attention. He nodded politely to the flight attendants and took his seat across the aisle, a few rows ahead of Sandra. She'd noticed him then, but hadn't made any move to acknowledge him, respecting what seemed to be a mutual desire for a peaceful journey. When the announcement came that boarding was complete, Sandra had felt a wave of tension when she realized Eileen Winters would be sitting beside her for the duration of the flight. The woman had already made several calls on her phone, speaking loudly about properties and investments, punctuating her conversations with frequent references to her important connections. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sandra had pulled her cap lower and turned more deliberately toward the window, hoping the next 5 hours would pass quickly. She couldn't have anticipated how quickly Eileen's behavior would escalate from merely annoying to deliberately hostile, nor how the situation would ultimately bring unexpected connections among the strangers sharing this pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Eileen's behavior became increasingly unbearable. The first-class cabin, normally an oasis of calm and discretion, had transformed into an uncomfortable theater with Eileen as the self-appointed star. After her initial outburst about being seated next to Sandra, she had settled into a pattern of not-so-subtle jabs and passive-aggressive comments. "I suppose even actresses need to fly commercial sometimes," Eileen remarked loudly while scrolling through her phone. "I thought your type always used private jets. Budget cuts?" She laughed at her own joke, glancing around as if expecting applause from an audience. Sandra remained composed, responding with brief politeness when directly addressed, but otherwise attempting to focus on her book. Her decades in Hollywood had taught her how to weather public unpleasantness with grace. Still, anyone watching closely enough might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders or the way she occasionally pressed her lips together, holding back words better left unsaid. The flight attendants did their best to manage the situation, offering Sandra extra attention when delivering drinks and meals, and trying to engage Eileen in conversation to redirect her focus. Their efforts met with limited success. "Do you know," Eileen announced after finishing her first glass of champagne, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "my husband and I attended that charity gala in New York last month, the one all the celebrities were at." She turned pointedly toward Sandra. "You weren't invited, were you? I don't recall seeing you there." The retired couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The young tech entrepreneur removed his headphones, his expression showing second-hand embarrassment at Eileen's behavior. The flight attendant approaching with the beverage cart visibly hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. 3 rows ahead, Keanu Reeves sat quietly. Though his back was to the scene, the set of his shoulders suggested he was listening. He had declined the offered headphones for the in-flight entertainment system, instead spending the first hour of the flight writing in a small, worn notebook. Occasionally, he would pause and seem to listen more intently to the interaction happening behind him. Eileen's phone chimed with a notification, and her eyes widened with delight at whatever she saw on the screen. "Oh, this is perfect," she said, turning the phone toward Sandra without invitation. "Look at this article about Hollywood has-beens trying to revive their careers. You're mentioned. Isn't that something?" Sandra finally looked directly at Eileen, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. "Mrs. Winters, I understand you're uncomfortable sitting next to me. I'd be happy to request a seat change myself if that would make your flight more enjoyable." "And have people think I was the problem?" "I don't think so," Eileen scoffed. "Besides, I'm gathering quite interesting material for my social media." My followers love insider stories about celebrities. She raised her phone again, clearly attempting to take another photo of Sandra. This crossed a line. The flight attendant stepped forward. "Ma'am, I must ask you to respect the privacy of all our passengers. Photography without permission isn't allowed. Do you know who my husband is?" Eileen's voice rose sharply. "One call from him to your CEO, and your job." The thread hung unfinished in the air as Keanu Reeves stood up. Without hurry, he retrieved something from the overhead compartment, then made his way down the aisle toward the brewing confrontation. His movement was casual, but purposeful. Eileen's expression changed instantly upon recognizing him, transforming from indignation to a practiced smile. "Well, this flight just got more interesting," she purred, already reaching for her phone again. Keanu paused beside their row, his calm presence somehow filling the space without domination. He looked at Eileen first, then at Sandra, and then back to Eileen. The entire cabin seemed to collectively hold its breath. What happened next would not only defuse the immediate tension, but would leave a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it, a masterclass in handling conflict with a dignity that neither wealth nor fame could purchase. "Mind if I join you both for a moment?" Keanu asked, his voice low and measured. Without waiting for an answer, he knelt in the aisle beside their row, positioning himself at eye level rather than standing over them. The small gesture immediately shifted the power dynamic in the confined space. Eileen straightened her posture, clearly delighted by this unexpected attention. "Of course not," she replied, her tone suddenly honeyed. "I was just having a friendly conversation with Ms. Bullock here." Keanu nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, folded photograph. "I've been carrying this around for years," he said, smoothing it open on his palm. "It's from the set of Speed. First big movie I did with Sandra." The photo showed a much younger Keanu and Sandra, both smiling during what appeared to be a break in filming. Nothing staged or glamorous, just two colleagues sharing a genuine moment. "I was pretty green back then," he continued, his eyes meeting Sandra's with warm recognition. "Nervous about the stunts, overthinking my lines. Sandra here, she saw I was struggling and took me aside one day." He turned the photo toward Eileen as if sharing a precious artifact. "She told me something I've never forgotten." The cabin had fallen completely silent. Even the flight attendants had paused their duties to listen. "She said, in this business, the only currency that matters in the end is how you treat people when the cameras aren't rolling." Keanu's smile deepened with the memory. "Then she spent an entire lunch break helping me work through a scene I was having trouble with, even though she'd already mastered her part." Sandra's expression softened with surprise, clearly touched that he had remembered and kept this memory close for so many years. "That film changed both our careers," Keanu continued, now addressing his words to Eileen directly. "But what I remember most isn't the stunts or the success. It's the kindness. Sandra's the real deal, treats every person on set the same, from the directors to the people serving coffee." Eileen's artificial smile had begun to falter, her fingers no longer poised to capture the moment for social media. For perhaps the first time since boarding, she seemed at a loss for words. Keanu carefully folded the photo and returned it to his pocket. "You mentioned your husband owns real estate in Manhattan," he said to Eileen, his tone remaining conversational rather than confrontational. "That's impressive. Buildings are lasting investments." He paused, glancing around the cabin before continuing. "I've been fortunate in my career. Made more money than I ever expected. But I've learned that what we own isn't what defines us." His eyes returned to Eileen's, holding her gaze steadily. "It's our actions in moments like this that show who we really are." The subtle rebuke landed like a feather, gentle but impossible to ignore. Several passengers nodded almost imperceptibly in agreement. "I actually came over because I wanted to thank you both," Keanu said, seamlessly shifting direction. "The Children's Hospital Foundation I support just received an anonymous donation that's going to fund a new recreation room. I was told it came from someone who worked on one of my films." He turned to Sandra with a questioning look. Sandra shook her head, genuine surprise evident in her expression. Wasn't me this time, though that's a wonderful cause. Well, whoever it was, Keanu continued, it reminded me how a single act of kindness creates ripples we might never see. That room will bring joy to kids going through unimaginable challenges. He rose slowly from his kneeling position. Sorry to interrupt your flight. Just wanted to share some good news. As he turned to return to his seat, he paused, reaching into his other pocket. Almost forgot, I brought these for anyone who might want them. He placed 2 small, elegant chocolate bars on Eileen's tray table. From this little shop in Vancouver. Best chocolate I've found. The simple gesture, treating both women exactly the same, despite Eileen's behavior, resonated through the cabin. Without another word, Keanu returned to his seat, leaving behind a profoundly altered atmosphere. Eileen stared at the chocolate bar before her, then at Sandra, who was already unwrapping hers with a small smile. Something in the wealthy woman's expression had changed, a hairline crack in her carefully constructed facade of superiority. For the remainder of the flight, an unusual quietness settled over the first-class cabin. Eileen sat motionless for several minutes after Keanu returned to his seat, the untouched chocolate bar still before her. The confident, demanding persona she had projected since boarding seemed to have receded, leaving behind a woman who appeared suddenly smaller, less certain in her expensive clothes. When the flight attendant next passed by, Eileen stopped her with a gentle touch on the arm rather than her previous imperious gestures. I've changed my mind about the red wine, she said, her voice noticeably softer. Just water, please. The flight attendant nodded, unable to completely hide her surprise at the transformation. Sandra continued reading her book, occasionally making notes in the margins, likely thoughts for her character in the film she'd just completed. She didn't attempt conversation with Eileen, but the tension between them had dissipated, replaced by something approaching a respectful distance. About an hour before landing, Eileen finally unwrapped her chocolate, breaking off a small piece and tasting it thoughtfully. He was right, she said, almost to herself. It is excellent. Sandra glanced up with a small smile. Keanu has always had good taste in the simple things. This brief exchange seemed to give Eileen permission to speak again. After a moment's hesitation, she turned slightly toward Sandra. My grandson is 9, she said, her voice lacking its earlier edge. He loved you in that animated film last year, watched it at least 20 times. That's very kind, Sandra replied. It was a fun project. I bought him all these expensive toys for his birthday, Eileen continued, looking down at her manicured hands. But what he really wanted was to show me that movie. I was always too busy. Something in her voice suggested this admission cost her more than the designer handbag resting at her feet. The retired couple across the aisle exchanged glances, the wife reaching over to squeeze her husband's hand. The tech entrepreneur, who had been surreptitiously watching the earlier drama unfold, quietly closed his laptop, choosing instead to gaze out the window at the clouds below. As the captain announced their initial descent into Los Angeles, Eileen reached into her purse and withdrew an embossed business card. She hesitated, then placed it on the armrest between herself and Sandra. My husband and I fund several arts programs in New York schools, she said, not quite meeting Sandra's eyes. We have a gala next month. If you're available. The invitation hung in the air, imperfect but sincere, an olive branch extended across the chasm her earlier behavior had created. Sandra looked at the card for a long moment before picking it up. I'll check my schedule, she said simply, tucking it into her book. When the plane finally touched down at LAX, there was no rush to disembark among the first-class passengers. Instead, as they gathered their belongings, there was a curious sense of community, brief nods and smiles exchanged between strangers who had witnessed something meaningful together. As they filed toward the exit, Keanu stepped back, allowing others to go ahead. When Sandra passed him, they shared a brief embrace. Just like old times, she said quietly. You showing up with perfect timing. Pure coincidence, he replied with that characteristic half-smile. But good to see you, Sandra. Eileen was the last to reach the door. She paused beside Keanu, her designer sunglasses already in place for the terminal. Mr. Reeves, she began, then seemed to reconsider whatever she had planned to say. Instead, she simply offered, "Thank you for the chocolate." Keanu nodded, understanding the words represented much more than appreciation for a small treat. 3 weeks later, a substantial anonymous donation arrived at the Children's Hospital Foundation Keanu had mentioned, enough to fund not just a recreation room but an entire new wing. The accompanying note contained just 4 words, "Ripples we never see." And 6 months after that, at a red carpet event in New York, photographers captured an unexpected moment, Sandra Bullock deep in conversation with Eileen Winters, both women laughing genuinely as Eileen's young grandson stood between them, beaming with excitement at meeting his favorite actress. The story of what happened on that flight circulated quietly among the flight attendants and passengers who witnessed it, becoming something of a legend within their circles, a reminder that true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort or success, but in how we handle conflict and correction. And that sometimes, the most powerful response to unkindness isn't matching its volume, but changing its direction entirely with a quiet word, a shared memory, and the simple gift of seeing another human being beneath their carefully constructed facades.